It was a crisp evening in Texas, and the grand hall was packed to capacity. Rows of chairs stretched from wall to wall, filled with people of all ages and walks of life. The hum of voices rose and fell, blending with the soft shuffling of papers and the occasional sound of footsteps as attendees settled into their seats. A tangible air of anticipation hung in the room, an electric undercurrent of excitement and curiosity. The spotlight illuminated the stage, casting a warm glow on the central podium where former President Donald Trump stood. His figure was both familiar and commanding, his trademark smile carrying a subtle hint of thoughtfulness. The crowd had been enthralled by his speech, where he'd recounted the pivotal moments of his life, his triumphs, his challenges, and the weight of the decisions he'd had to make. The stories had drawn laughter, applause, and moments of quiet reflection from the audience. As he finished, Trump took a step back, scanning the room with a contemplative expression. His voice, firm yet personable, echoed as he thanked the crowd for their unwavering support. Then, he handed the moment over to the audience. "Now, I'd like to hear from you," he said, his voice carrying both warmth and curiosity. "If there's something on your mind, a question, a thought, or even a concern, this is your chance. I'm here to listen." The room fell silent. A brief lull as people processed the invitation. The moderator stepped forward, holding a microphone, scanning the sea of eager faces. Suddenly, from the middle of the room, a small figure stood up. A young girl, no more than 10 years old, slowly made her way toward the microphone designated for audience questions. Her golden hair caught the light as it fell gently over her shoulders, and her steps were steady, unhurried, unlike the adults who hesitated or whispered among themselves. The girl radiated an air of calm confidence. The room shifted. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Heads turned, and all eyes fixed on the girl as she reached the microphone. Even Trump, standing tall at the podium, seemed intrigued by her presence. The girl's voice rang out, clear and steady, carrying a surprising maturity for someone her age. It cut through the stillness of the hall like a gentle yet powerful wave. "Mr. Trump, I just want to ask, are you God's chosen one?" She paused briefly, her bright eyes locked onto the stage. Then she added, her tone soft yet profound, "I've heard people say that God has a plan for everyone. What is God's plan for you?" For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The weight of her question hung heavily in the air, rippling through the crowd like a stone dropped into still water. A few audible gasps escaped from the audience, and whispers began to ripple across the rows. Some people exchanged wide-eyed glances, as if unsure of what they had just heard, while others sat perfectly still, captivated by the sheer depth of the child's words. Trump, standing behind the podium, was momentarily taken aback. His hands, which had been resting lightly on the edges of the podium, tightened ever so slightly. His expression softened, and a flicker of emotion crossed his face, perhaps surprise, perhaps reflection. It was a rare moment of vulnerability in a man so often seen as unshakable. Even he seemed to recognize the gravity of the question, not just as an inquiry directed at him, but as a larger reflection of faith, purpose, and responsibility. He took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the young girl. His usual commanding presence gave way to something quieter, more introspective, as if he too was considering the answer not only for her, but for himself. In the silence that followed, the crowd waited. Some leaned forward in their seats, eager to hear how Trump would respond to such an innocent yet profound question. Others folded their arms, their expressions a mix of curiosity and skepticism. The atmosphere in the hall shifted from excitement to something more solemn, almost sacred, as if everyone present understood they were witnessing a moment that transcended the usual political exchanges. The young girl remained standing, her gaze unwavering. The microphone, just slightly too tall for her, wobbled gently as she gripped it with her small hands. She didn't look nervous, though the slight quiver of her voice hinted at the courage it had taken to stand up and ask such a question in front of hundreds of strangers, and to the former president of the United States. No less. Trump's expression softened further, and for a moment, it seemed as though he was seeing the world through her eyes, simple, honest, and filled with the kind of wonder that only a child could bring. The former president's usual composed demeanor softened, and a quiet thoughtfulness replaced his confident posture. He rested his hands on the edges of the podium, leaning forward slightly as if to bridge the gap between himself and the hundreds of eyes watching him. His deep, resonant voice finally broke the silence, filled with a rare sense of vulnerability. That is truly a very special question. Young lady, I would never dare to call myself God's chosen one, but I do believe that God has a plan for each and every one of us. And sometimes, that plan isn't meant for perfect people. God often chooses those with flaws to do great things because it's their imperfections that remind them of the responsibility they hold to others. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the crowd. His eyes scanned the room, making contact with individuals as though he were speaking directly to each person. There was a stillness in his demeanor that commanded attention, not through power, but through sincerity. He continued, his voice steady but deeply reflective. If God has truly chosen me, it's not a badge of honor to wear. It's a sacred responsibility, and that responsibility isn't easy. It means protecting human freedom, standing up for the weak, and, above all, keeping alive the faith and values that we hold so dear. I am far from perfect, believe me. I know that better than anyone, but I believe that everything I do comes from my heart and from the guidance I feel God has given me. Trump's tone shifted slightly, becoming quieter, almost as if he were confiding in the room, inviting them into a deeply personal moment. You know, there's one moment in my life when I felt God's plan more clearly than ever before. It was the day I made the decision to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. He paused, his gaze drifting upward, as though reliving that moment in his mind. His voice took on a contemplative quality as he continued. That wasn't an easy decision. Believe me, the pressure from every direction was intense. I had advisors telling me it was too risky, that it could destabilize the region, that it might even harm America's position on the world stage. Some said it was reckless, dangerous, even foolish. But deep in my heart, I felt something that I couldn't ignore. It was as if God Himself was whispering to me, "This is the time to act." To reaffirm that Jerusalem is the eternal city of my people. The room was utterly silent, every word landing with a profound weight. Trump's voice grew even softer, almost introspective, as he shared more. To many, that decision may have seemed like just another political move. But to me, it was so much more than that. It felt like a mission, something far bigger than myself. That was when I truly realized that God doesn't need great people to do His work. He just needs people who are willing to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. His words hung in the air, filling the room with a sense of gravity that went beyond the moment. Trump's usual bravado was absent, replaced instead by a quiet strength, a profound understanding of the responsibility that comes with leadership. He paused again, his expression softening as his gaze returned to the little girl who had asked the question. For a fleeting moment, the lines of power and politics seemed to blur, and all that remained was a man grappling with his place in something far greater than himself. The silence in the room was almost deafening, the crowd seemingly afraid to break the spell of what had just been shared. Trump's response wasn't just an answer to the little girl. It was a reflection of the universal human desire for purpose, for faith, and for the courage to rise to the challenges placed before us. And in that moment, it was clear that his words had reached far beyond the young girl who had asked the question. They had touched the hearts of everyone in the room, leaving them with a sense of reverence for the weight of responsibility, the imperfections of humanity, and the boundless possibilities of faith. The hall echoed with scattered applause as Trump finished his heartfelt response. While some clapped enthusiastically, others sat in thoughtful silence, their expressions contemplative. The weight of Trump's words still lingered in the air, and for a moment, it felt as though the entire room was grappling with the depth of what had been said. But before the quiet reflection could take hold, a sharp voice broke through the atmosphere like a crack of thunder. "Mr. Trump, I'm sorry, but I cannot agree with you." The voice belonged to a man seated near the back of the room. He abruptly stood up, his movements deliberate and firm. Dressed in a simple gray shirt, his expression was a mix of tension and determination. The room turned its attention to him, the sound of his voice slicing through the hushed reverence. "How can you even suggest that you might be God's chosen one?" he continued, his tone laced with both skepticism and frustration. As he spoke, he stepped toward one of the audience microphones. The crowd's focus shifted with him, their eyes following his every move. His face was serious, and his voice grew sharper, each word weighted with conviction. "You say that God has a plan for you, but are your actions truly aligned with Christian values? Jesus taught us humility, love, and forgiveness, but your leadership style, your harsh words, your divisive rhetoric, your controversial actions, do they really reflect those teachings? Or are you just using religion as a tool for political gain?" A murmur swept through the crowd, like the rustling of leaves before a storm. Some people exchanged uneasy glances, their eyebrows raised in agreement, while others frowned in disapproval. The man didn't falter. If anything, the murmurs seemed to embolden him. He gripped the edge of the microphone stand, leaning forward slightly as his voice grew more intense. "I'm not denying that you've done great things, Mr. Trump," he added, his tone shifting to one of reluctant acknowledgement. "But if we start calling any politician God's chosen one, aren't we treading on dangerous ground? Isn't that turning faith into a weapon of power? Doesn't that risk distorting what religion stands for and creating even deeper divisions among us?" The man's words landed like arrows, each one piercing the room's charged atmosphere. A few audible gasps escaped from the audience, and the murmurs swelled into a low hum of conversation. In the rows closest to the stage, a middle-aged woman turned to the person next to her and whispered, "He's got a point. We have to be careful with how we mix politics and faith." But not everyone was in agreement. Near the front of the hall, an older man shook his head emphatically, muttering under his breath, "That's not fair. He's completely missing the point." The crowd began to show visible signs of division. Some nodded along with the man's critique, their expressions thoughtful and serious. Others folded their arms or leaned back in their seats, Their faces a mixture of annoyance and disbelief. The tension in the room was palpable, as though the very air had grown heavier. The man at the microphone, his voice steady but brimming with passion, pressed on. Faith is supposed to unite us, not divide us. It's supposed to inspire love, not be wielded as a tool for power. And yet, calling any leader God's chosen one, especially one with such a controversial record, feels like we're twisting faith into something it was never meant to be. As his final words echoed through the room, the man stepped back from the microphone, his face flushed but resolute. The crowd buzzed with a mix of agreement and dissent. Snippets of whispered conversations floated through the air. He's not wrong, but he's oversimplifying things. That's exactly what I've been thinking. This isn't the place for that kind of challenge. The divide in the room became more apparent, with one side aligning themselves with the man's sharp critique and the other growing visibly uncomfortable with what they perceived as an unfair attack. And yet, amidst the ripples of conversation and the clash of opinions, one thing was clear. All eyes had turned back to Trump. The former president stood motionless at the podium, his hands resting lightly on its edges. His expression was unreadable, neither defensive nor dismissive. Instead, there was a quiet intensity in his gaze, as though he were carefully weighing his next words. The room waited, the murmurs slowly fading into silence once more. The audience was now a sea of expectant faces, some filled with agreement, others with skepticism, all waiting to see how Trump would respond to this bold and unexpected challenge. As the tension in the hall reached its breaking point, an elderly woman rose from her seat. She moved slowly but deliberately, her silver hair neatly tucked under a light scarf, and a coat embroidered with a small cross on her chest. Though her frame was slight, there was an undeniable strength in the way she carried herself. Her presence alone began to shift the atmosphere, drawing the attention of those nearby. She made her way to the nearest microphone, her steps measured but steady. By the time she reached it, the murmurs of the crowd had softened, as though her quiet determination had a calming effect. Adjusting the microphone slightly, she leaned in, her voice calm but resolute as it broke through the tension in the room. "Sir," she began, turning her gaze toward the man who had spoken earlier, "I understand your concerns, and I respect that you feel strongly about them. But I must say this: God doesn't choose perfect people to carry out his plans. History has shown us that time and time again." Her voice, though measured, carried a depth that commanded attention. The room grew quieter as she continued. "In the Bible, God chose King Cyrus, a pagan ruler, to deliver the Israelites. King Cyrus wasn't a believer. He didn't even know God, and yet, he was chosen to fulfill a divine mission. Why? Because God doesn't need perfection. He needs willingness. And Mr. Trump, though imperfect, is fulfilling important work that I believe God has placed in his hands." She paused, lifting her gaze to sweep across the room. Her eyes were clear, filled with a steady determination that seemed to reach each person individually. She took a breath, her voice growing stronger, infused with conviction. "Look at the actions he's taken." Mr. Trump moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, a critical step for those who believe in the prophecies of the Bible. That decision wasn't easy. It faced enormous opposition, but he stood firm. He has appointed judges who stand for the sanctity of life. He has upheld the values of family and protected religious freedom in a time when those freedoms feel increasingly under attack. These are not random acts. They are deliberate actions that show he is working within a plan far greater than himself. The room seemed to shift again, the murmurs now replaced by a thoughtful quiet. The woman's words hung in the air as she paused once more, gathering herself before continuing with deliberate and firm resolve. Being chosen by God is not a privilege to boast about. It's a burden of responsibility. It's a calling that requires strength, endurance, and a willingness to face criticism, even when it feels unbearable. The chosen must often walk a lonely path, and I believe that Mr. Trump, with all his flaws and mistakes, like any of us, has shown that he is willing to carry that burden. I do not see a man seeking glory for himself. I see someone who is carrying the sacred duty of protecting the faith and values that define us. Her words weren't spoken with anger or defensiveness, but with a quiet, profound authority that seemed to resonate with the very soul of the room. A few people nodded in agreement, their faces softening as the meaning of her words began to sink in. Even those who had been critical just moments before seemed to lean back in their chairs, lost in thought. The woman turned her gaze once more, as if addressing everyone present. Faith isn't about perfection. It's about purpose. It's about being willing to take on challenges that are bigger than ourselves and trusting that God can use us, flaws and all, to make a difference. That's what I see in Mr. Trump. And whether or not you agree with everything he's done, it's undeniable that he has stood firm in his convictions and fought for what he believes is right. The murmurs that had filled the room earlier faded entirely now, replaced by an almost reverent stillness. The woman stepped back from the microphone, her expression calm yet resolute. For a moment, no one spoke. Her rebuttal had not only defended Trump, but had reminded everyone present of the deeper meaning of faith, responsibility, and the sacrifices that come with being chosen. The tension that had once gripped the room seemed to dissipate, replaced by a quiet introspection. People exchanged glances, their expressions less polarized, as though the woman's words had bridged the divide and brought a moment of unity, however brief, to the crowded hall. Trump stood tall behind the podium, his gaze steady as he raised a hand to signal for silence. The soft murmur of whispers in the crowd faded almost instantly. The room had been on edge since the heated exchange moments earlier, and now all eyes were fixed on him, waiting for his response. He took a measured step forward, closing the distance between himself and the audience, as if to connect more directly with those in the room. Resting his hands lightly on the podium, Trump's voice emerged calm, yet laced with a reflective tone that felt far more personal than political. Thank you both for speaking up. Your perspectives are thought-provoking, and I respect them deeply. But let me make one thing clear. I am not here to argue about who is right or wrong, nor to claim that I am someone special. He paused, scanning the audience as though trying to reach each individual in the room. His expression softened, his tone slowing, carrying the weight of sincerity. I am just a man, imperfect, flawed, sometimes misunderstood. But I believe that God has chosen all of us, each in our own way, to fulfill our roles in His great plan. The words lingered in the air for a moment, drawing the audience into his reflection. Trump adjusted his stance slightly, leaning into the podium as though speaking directly from his heart. His voice took on a deeper, almost confessional quality. If God has chosen me to bear this responsibility, it is not a badge of honor to boast about. It is a challenge to do what is right, even when it is the hardest thing to do. There are times when I feel I lack the strength, when I feel unworthy of the role I've been given. And believe me, I've faced moments of doubt, times when the weight of it all felt too much to carry. He paused briefly, his hands gripping the edges of the podium as he gathered his thoughts. His voice softened, yet there was an unshakable conviction behind it. But in those moments, I pray. I pray for guidance, for courage, for the ability to stand firm. And each time, I feel God granting me the strength to keep going, not for myself, but for the people I've been entrusted to serve. Trump's gaze shifted, scanning the faces in the crowd. His eyes carried a quiet determination, meeting the skeptical stares with as much respect as the supportive ones. He straightened his posture, his tone growing steadier, firmer. I know that my actions will not please everyone. I know there are those who question my motives, who wonder if I truly act with faith in my heart. But I can say this: I have always tried to do what I believe aligns with God's values, protecting freedom, standing up for what is right, building a better future for the generations to come. These are not easy goals. They require sacrifice, and they demand resilience. The crowd remained silent. The tension that had gripped the room moments earlier now replaced by an almost reverent stillness. Trump's voice softened once again as he leaned closer to the microphone, as if confiding in the audience. God doesn't choose perfect people. He doesn't need them. He chooses people who are willing to stand up, not because they are great, but because they are willing to put the needs of others above their own. It's not about being flawless. It's about being willing to take on the responsibility, no matter the cost. His words seemed to land with a weight that reached far beyond the confines of the room. Trump stood silent for a moment, letting the meaning of his statement settle over the audience. Then, with a slight nod, he delivered his final message, his voice carrying both hope and resolve. I hope each of us here, no matter our position, can find our own mission and live according to what God wants from us. Because whether we lead a nation or a family, each of us has a role to play in God's greater plan. For a few moments, the room remained utterly still, as though everyone present was processing the depth of his words. Then, slowly, a smattering of applause broke out from the back of the hall. It was hesitant at first, but it quickly grew, rolling forward like a wave until the entire room was filled with the sound of unified clapping. The applause wasn't the exuberant kind that follows a rousing political speech. Instead, it carried a quieter, more meaningful tone, one born of understanding, reflection, and perhaps even a touch of newfound respect. Trump stood at the podium, nodding slightly in acknowledgement, his expression one of humility. In that moment, he wasn't just a leader addressing his supporters. He was a man who had shared a part of himself, offering not just an explanation but an invitation, a call for everyone in the room to reflect on their own purpose, their own responsibilities, and their own place in a plan far greater than themselves. As the event neared its conclusion, the little girl from earlier unexpectedly walked up onto the stage. Once again, every eye in the room turned to her, and the hall fell silent. She approached Trump, her bright eyes filled with determination, though her small hands trembled slightly as they reached out to hold his. Her voice, clear and full of emotion, broke through the stillness. "Mr. Trump, I believe that God chose you, not just to be president, but to bring hope. Your answer has helped me understand that being chosen by God isn't about doing great things for yourself, but about doing good things for others. If you can do such big things, then I want to be someone chosen by God too, so I can help the people around me. Those words, innocent yet heartfelt, were like a warm ray of light piercing through the heavy atmosphere left by the earlier debates. Trump bent down slightly, his expression softening as he looked at the girl, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. He smiled, a smile no longer of a politician, but of a deeply moved human being. His voice, warm and inspiring, filled the room. You know, what you just said is the most precious gift I could have received today. You don't have to be a president to do good things. God chooses all of us to spread love and kindness, even in the smallest acts, like helping a friend, comforting someone who's sad, or simply living each day with goodness in your heart. And you've already done that, just with your honest words. Trump leaned down to embrace the girl, and as he did, tears began to well up in the eyes of many in the audience. The applause erupted, not as a reaction to a political speech, but as an outpouring of emotion from hearts touched by the connection, understanding, and hope that moment had inspired. The event ended, not merely as a story of faith and responsibility, but as a powerful reminder that anyone, whether a leader or a small child, can become chosen if they live with compassion and dedication to others. This story doesn't end with words alone. It reveals a profound truth: the chosen one isn't someone perfect or exceptional, but someone willing to recognize their role in a plan far greater than themselves. Being chosen isn't an honor to boast about. It's a burden of responsibility. The chosen must face criticism, doubt, and often loneliness. They cannot afford to crumble under pressure because their mission is not just for their own benefit, but for the people they represent and protect. Trump didn't claim to be the chosen one, but his actions spoke volumes. Defending religious freedom, standing firm on a pro-life stance, and moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. These were all bold decisions, filled with risk and sacrifice. They weren't just political moves, but strong declarations of faith and the values he stood for. More importantly, this story highlights that God doesn't choose perfect people. He chooses those who are willing to act, who are unafraid of challenges, and who dare to put the interests of their community above their own. Trump, with all his flaws and imperfections, demonstrated that what matters isn't how you start, but how you use the opportunities given to you to serve a purpose greater than yourself. His story serves as a reminder to everyone. Anyone can become the chosen one if they are willing to sacrifice, face adversity, and live in alignment with the values they believe in. In that moment, the entire hall seemed to realize that they, too, carry the potential to fulfill a mission, big or small, within God's greater plan.